All right, let's dive right in. You ever had someone pull away from you, emotionally disappear, only to show up again like nothing happened? It's confusing, frustrating. And if you're not careful, it'll mess with your head. But here's the thing. There's a reason they come back. It's not random. It's not magic. It's psychology. Today, we're breaking down exactly why avoidance, those people who push love away when it gets too close, suddenly come back around. We're going to talk about what flips that switch in their mind, what triggers the urge to reconnect, and more importantly, how you can see it for what it is, so you stop second-guessing your worth. Let's get into it. People with an avoidant attachment style often develop this way of relating to others due to early life experiences where emotional needs weren't consistently met. Maybe they were raised in environments where vulnerability was discouraged, independence was overemphasized, or emotional connection wasn't modeled in a healthy way. As a result, they learn consciously or unconsciously that relying on others is unsafe or unpredictable. So what do? They become self-reliant to the extreme. They tell themselves they don't need anyone. They suppress emotions. They focus on achievement, logic, control, anything but emotional intimacy. When an avoidant person enters into a relationship, they might appear incredibly confident, independent, even alluring at first. There's a certain emotional distance that can be attractive because it feels composed, mature, even mysterious. But underneath that cool, calm surface, there's a deep fear of vulnerability. As closeness builds, so does anxiety. The more emotionally intimate the connection becomes, the more threatened they feel. Not because they don't care, but because caring deeply exposes them to potential pain, rejection, or a loss of autonomy. And that's something they've spent their entire lives avoiding. Avoidants are not heartless. That's a myth. In fact, they often feel more than they're willing to admit, even to themselves. But instead of expressing these feelings or working through them, they detach, they intellectualize, they find reasons to pull away. Suddenly, they're too busy or unsure or not ready. They may nitpick the relationship or find flaws in their partner to justify their discomfort. It's not that they don't want love. It's that they fear what comes with it, the dependency, the vulnerability, the risk. What's particularly confusing for partners of avoidance is the push-pull dynamic. One minute they're warm, engaged, even romantic. The next, they're distant, aloof, maybe even cold. It sends mixed signals that can be emotionally exhausting. And for someone who's more anxiously attached or simply more secure and open, this can trigger deep feelings of inadequacy or confusion. But the behavior isn't about you. It's about their internal wiring. They're protecting themselves in the only way they know how, by keeping emotional closeness at arm's length. Avoidants often don't understand their own behavior. They may genuinely be confused by their reactions. They may say things like, "I don't know why I feel this way," or "I just need space," without realizing that their need for space is rooted in fear rather than actual incompatibility. Relationships activate their attachment system in a way that feels threatening, especially when things are going well. And ironically, the more they like someone, the more likely they are to shut down because they have more to lose. Another critical aspect is their view of themselves and others. Avoidants often carry an internal narrative that they must be self-sufficient to be worthy. They may even believe that needing someone makes them weak or defective. At the same time, they may hold others to impossible standards or assume that people will inevitably disappoint or abandon them. So they preemptively detach, assuming emotional distance will protect them. But all it really does is isolate them from the connection they deeply crave. In the context of a relationship, avoidance can function well as long as things remain light, surface level, or transactional. But when deeper emotional needs arise, when a partner asks for vulnerability, emotional availability, or more connection, that's when their defenses kick in. It's not that they're incapable of love. It's that they're terrified of vulnerability love requires. They may retreat, shut down, or even end the relationship. Not because it wasn't meaningful, but because it became too emotionally intense for them to handle. Understanding this dynamic is crucial, not just for partners of avoidance, but for avoidants themselves. The first step toward healthier relationships is awareness, recognizing that this pattern is not fixed or permanent, but rooted in past experiences that shaped their emotional responses. When avoidants begin to see their distancing behavior as a form of self-protection rather than truth, they open the door to growth. They can learn to tolerate discomfort, communicate their needs, and gradually build emotional resilience. But it takes work, reflection, and sometimes support from therapy or coaching to unpack those layers and begin healing. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, intimacy doesn't feel like comfort, it feels like a threat. That's a key distinction. While many people crave closeness, connection, and emotional bonding, avoidants are wired to feel unease when relationships move into deeper emotional territory. This doesn't mean they don't want love or connection. It means their nervous system interprets closeness as risky. That risk triggers a survival response, not necessarily a dramatic one, but a quiet internal resistance. The closer someone gets emotionally, the more the avoidant instinctively backs away. It's a protective mechanism formed early in life, often as a way to cope with emotional neglect, inconsistency, or pressure to be emotionally self-sufficient. In many cases, avoidants grow up in environments where expressing vulnerability was met with rejection, punishment, or emotional distance. They learn to associate emotional needs with disappointment. Over time, they built an internal blueprint. Stay in control, don't get too close, and you won't get hurt. This doesn't always happen in overtly traumatic households. Sometimes it's subtle. A child may have felt emotionally invisible, or learned that the only way to receive affection was to perform, achieve, or suppress their own needs in favor of someone else's comfort. That child becomes an adult who equates emotional intimacy with the loss of control, autonomy, or safety. So when someone starts to genuinely care for them, when a partner gets emotionally invested, asks deep questions, expresses love, something in the avoidant starts to panic. That panic doesn't always look dramatic. It might show up as pulling away slightly, feeling irritable, needing space, or suddenly becoming busy with work or distractions. The avoidant doesn't always realize this is happening. To them, it just feels like something is off or like they're not ready. They might convince themselves that the relationship moved too fast or that their partner is too much. But underneath that is the real issue. Intimacy feels unsafe because it demands emotional vulnerability, and that's something they were trained to avoid. What adds to the complexity is that avoidants tend to value independence above all else. They've learned to feel safest when they're emotionally self-reliant. So when a relationship starts to require mutual dependency, when their partner naturally expects them to be emotionally available, supportive, or expressive, the avoidant can interpret this as pressure or control. Instead of feeling loved, they feel trapped. Even simple expressions of affection can feel overwhelming, like they're being cornered emotionally. This leads them to shut down or withdraw in subtle ways. Less texting, shorter conversations, a focus on logistics over feeling. Avoidants often rationalize their behavior in ways that make sense to them. They might say they need balance or that they're independent by nature, and while there's truth in those statements, it's often a cover for the deeper discomfort they feel around vulnerability. They might push for more physical space in a relationship not because they don't care, but because the emotional demands are triggering their fear of engulfment or loss of self. They might even end a relationship that seems perfectly fine on the surface, simply because it's getting too emotionally intense and they don't know how to manage that intensity. Here's the paradox. Avoidants often want love just as much as anyone else. They want connection. They want someone who understands them. But the moment they start to feel those things, their old protective programming kicks in. That programming says, this is dangerous. You could get hurt. You need to pull back. So they do. Not because they don't care, but because that fear of losing control, of becoming dependent, of being emotionally exposed, feels greater than the potential reward of connection. Understanding this internal conflict helps to reframe their behavior. It's not about being cold, uncaring, or manipulative. It's about a nervous system that equates intimacy with emotional risk. That's why distance feels safer than intimacy. That's why they may sabotage relationships just when things are going well. It's not logical. It's emotional reflex. And unless they become conscious of that reflex and actively work to change it, the pattern repeats. The challenge for the avoidant is to recognize that true connection does not mean losing control. It means being seen, accepted, and connected while still maintaining autonomy. That takes emotional maturity and a willingness to sit with discomfort. Avoidants have to learn that closeness doesn't have to mean danger, and that being vulnerable with the right person is not a trap, but a gateway to real intimacy. It's not an easy shift. But it's a necessary one if they want to move beyond the fear and build relationships that are not only safe, but deeply fulfilling. One of the most common misconceptions about avoidant individuals is that they simply lose interest and move on without a second thought. But that isn't entirely accurate. The truth is more complex and more emotional than it appears on the surface. Avoidants often pull away not because they don't feel anything, but because they feel too much and don't know how to process it. One of the most powerful internal triggers for avoidance is the fear of losing control of their emotions, of the relationship, of themselves. This fear can override even their strongest feelings for someone, leading them to disconnect, withdraw, or sabotage the relationship entirely. When an avoidant starts to care deeply for someone, they may experience emotions that feel overwhelming or even threatening. These feelings, love, longing, vulnerability, intimacy, start to stir up a part of them that has long been dormant or carefully locked away. The emotions don't feel good to them, even if the relationship is healthy. In fact, the healthier and more emotionally available their partner is, the more their internal alarm system goes off. Why? Because closeness means unpredictability. It means they can't fully control the outcome. And for someone with an avoidant attachment style, not being in control is terrifying. This fear of losing control doesn't always show up dramatically. Sometimes it looks like the avoidant pulling back after a particularly intimate moment, maybe after a deep conversation or a romantic weekend. Other times it shows up as sudden doubt. Is this right for me? Do I really want this? I need space to figure things out. These thoughts aren't always rational. They're protective. The avoidant is trying to regain control by creating distance. They need to reestablish emotional safety, not necessarily from the other person, but from the intensity of their own feelings. The relationship begins to feel like it's demanding something from them, something they're not sure they can give. Emotional availability, vulnerability, consistency. These are things the avoidant may not be used to offering, and being asked to do so can feel like pressure, even if it's not intended that way. As a result, they retreat into their comfort zone, solitude, independence, detachment. This is where they feel most in control. It's not that they're punishing their partner or playing games. It's that they're trying to quiet the internal chaos by minimizing emotional risk. But here's the twist. That same fear that causes them to pull away can also trigger the desire to reconnect. When they create distance, they initially feel relief. They feel safe again. But after a while, another emotion starts to creep in: emptiness, loneliness, the realization that they miss the connection. And yet this return is also driven by control, reaching back out, reinitiating contact, re-entering the dynamic on their terms gives them a sense of power. It allows them to control when and how the intimacy resumes, making it feel less threatening. This cycle can repeat over and over. Emotional closeness triggers fear. The fear triggers withdrawal. Withdrawal leads to longing, and longing prompts re-engagement. The common thread is the fear of losing emotional control, of being swept up in something they can't predict or manage. Even the act of missing someone can become a source of anxiety because it reminds the avoidant that they're not as detached or unaffected as they'd like to believe. The fear of losing control is deeply rooted in a belief system formed long before their current relationship. Often, avoidants were once children who felt like their needs weren't met unless they suppressed their emotions. Maybe they learned that being too needy or emotional led to rejection, ridicule, or disappointment. So they decided early on that they would never depend on anyone again. That vow to be emotionally self-sufficient becomes the lens through which they see all future recurs. But here's the truth. Control is an illusion when it comes to love. Real connection requires surrender, trust, and risk. For avoidants to break the cycle, they need to start recognizing that their fear of losing control isn't protecting them. It's limiting them. It's keeping them from experiencing the fullness of connection, the depth of love, and the emotional growth that only comes from allowing someone in. It's not about becoming completely open overnight. It's about learning to tolerate discomfort, to sit with vulnerability without running from it. Control doesn't have to mean emotional shutdown. True control is choosing to face the fear and lean into connection anyway. And for those loving an avoidant, understanding this trigger can shift your perspective. Their withdrawal isn't necessarily about you. It's a response to an internal fear that's bigger than the present moment. Compassion and boundaries both matter. But above all, recognizing the root of their behavior is key, because the fear of losing control is not a sign they don't care. It's often a sign that they care more than they know how to handle. When an avoidant partner pulls away, it often feels final. The silence, the detachment, the sudden shift in warmth, it can be jarring and painful for the person on the receiving end. But here's what many people don't realize. Time and space are not just tools avoidants use to escape intimacy. They're also catalysts for re-engagement. Distance, though painful for the other person, often plays a key role in the avoidant's eventual return. The very thing that seems to end the connection, space, is also what can reignite their desire to reconnect. Avoidants thrive on emotional independence. When they feel their autonomy is threatened, they retreat. That space allows them to feel like themselves again. They're no longer overwhelmed by someone else's needs, emotions, or expectations. They can breathe, they can think clearly, and for a while that feels good to them. It's calming, it resets their nervous system. But over time, that same space that brought them relief also brings reflection. The quiet creates room for feelings they tried to suppress. They start to think about the relationship, about what was good, about what they miss. And often they start to wonder, did I overreact? Was it really too much, or was I just scared? Avoidants need that distance to sort through what they're feeling. Unlike securely attached individuals who often process emotions in real time and through connection, avoidants process emotions internally, and slow emotional closeness feels chaotic in the moment. But with time, they can look back and start to interpret their feelings more accurately. They may begin to see that the closeness wasn't actually threatening, that their partner wasn't too needy, that the relationship wasn't as suffocating as it felt when they were in it. But they can only come to those conclusions once they've had space from the emotional intensity. The power of time also lies in its ability to soften defenses. Immediately after distancing themselves, avoidants are often in self-protection mode. Their walls are high. Their internal story is focused on justifying the retreat. This wasn't right for me. I need someone who understands my need for space, or even relationships just aren't for me. But with time, those defenses can weaken. The emotionless narrative starts to break down as real feelings resurface, feelings they didn't know how to express or even fully acknowledge before. They may start to miss the emotional support, the shared moments, the connection they once tried to escape. This is often when they come back. Not necessarily with a grand apology or a deep understanding of what went wrong, but with subtle re-entry. A text, a casual check-in, a comment on social media. They're testing the waters, trying to see if the door is still open. For them, this step feels safer now that the emotional pressure has subsided. Reconnecting on their terms after having time and space feels far less threatening than being asked to re-engage during emotional conflict or vulnerability. There's also something else happening beneath the surface. Their attachment system is reactivating. Just as emotional closeness can trigger avoidance, emotional absence can trigger longing. Humans are wired for connection, even those with avoidant tendencies. And once the fear has cooled off, the need for attachment starts to reemerge. Time creates that window. The panic of closeness is gone, and now the discomfort of absence takes its place. The space they once craved starts to feel empty, and they begin to revalue what they had. But this cycle of detachment and return can be confusing and painful for their partner. One moment it seems like the relationship is over, and the next the avoidant is back acting as if nothing happened. This isn't about manipulation or cruelty. It's about the push-pull dynamic created by conflicting needs, the need for independence and the need for connection. Time and space allow the avoidant to oscillate between those needs, to find temporary balance. But without self-awareness, the cycle can become a repeating pattern. Get close, feel overwhelmed, pull away, reflect, return. The key thing to understand is that their return often isn't because they've resolved their avoidant tendencies. It's because time and space gave them temporary relief from the emotional overload that caused them to leave. They may still struggle with the same fears. They may still pull away again if the relationship gets too emotionally intense. That's why their return isn't necessarily a sign that everything is fine or that they're ready for deeper intimacy. It's a sign that the distance gave them enough safety to reapproach. For the avoidant to truly grow, they need to learn how to manage emotional intensity without needing to create distance every time. That means recognizing when their fear is being triggered, communicating their needs more openly, and slowly building their capacity to stay present in the face of closeness. Time and space are helpful in the short term, but long-term connection requires learning how to regulate those emotions without needing to constantly retreat. Only then can real intimacy begin to feel safe and sustainable. Avoidant individuals are often misunderstood as cold or emotionally detached, but in truth, many of their behaviors are rooted in fear and defense. One of the most powerful internal forces that drives their return after distancing is nostalgia, more specifically, selective nostalgia. This is not the kind of well-rounded reflection that includes both the good and the bad. It's a mental highlight reel, filtered through a lens that makes the past relationship look safer, warmer, and more desirable than it may have actually felt to them in real time. And that selective memory plays a major role in why avoidants come back after they've pulled away. When avoidants withdraw, it's usually because the emotional closeness has become overwhelming. The relationship feels intense, or too demanding, or simply unfamiliar in its level of vulnerability. In the moment, their primary goal is to regain emotional control. Distance brings immediate relief. It gives them space to reset, to feel like themselves again, and to avoid the emotional chaos they associate with intimacy. But over time, as the anxiety fades and the emotional pressure diminishes, something surprising begins to happen. They start to remember the good parts. And they don't just remember them, they amplify them. The mind begins to replay the laughter, the comfort, the sense of companionship. They think about the way their partner looked at them, the things they did together, the feeling of being wanted. But notably, they often block out or minimize the parts that triggered their withdrawal in the first place. The moments where they felt smothered, overwhelmed, or emotionally vulnerable don't resurface in the same vivid way. The distance allows their mind to rewrite the emotional story into something safer, more nostalgic, more palatable. This process of selective memory is partly subconscious. Avoidants aren't always aware that they're filtering their recollections. To them, it can feel like clarity, like they're finally seeing the relationship from a neutral perspective now that they've had space. But the truth is, they're not seeing the full picture. They're seeing the version of it that doesn't trigger fear. The emotional intensity is gone, so their defenses are down. That allows warmth to come through. And when that warmth surfaces, it sparks a desire to reconnect, not necessarily with the reality of the relationship, but with the idea of it as they remember it now. Nostalgia creates emotional safety. It lets the avoidant engage with the relationship from a distance, mentally, emotionally, and often literally. They can idealize their partner without feeling the pressure to immediately act on those feelings in a vulnerable way. This idealization serves as a buffer. They miss the connection, but in a way that doesn't require them to confront their fear of intimacy, at least not yet. So they reach out, they send a text, they watch their partner's story, they reappear with casual contact that feels low stakes to them, but might feel significant to the other person. This return is often confusing. How can someone who seemed distant or disinterested now act nostalgic and warm? The answer lies in their emotional distance. Time and space allowed their fear to quiet down, and now nostalgia is running the show. It's not that they've had a deep breakthrough, it's that they've created enough emotional safety for themselves that they can revisit the connection without feeling immediately threatened. But because their memory is selective, they're often unprepared for what happens when the relationship starts to get close again. Once reconnected, avoidants may again feel the same discomfort that led them to withdraw in the first place. The reality of emotional closeness doesn't match the fantasy their nostalgia constructed. And unless they've done the inner work to understand and regulate their attachment patterns, the cycle can restart, feel good, get close, get overwhelmed, pull away. This is why the avoidance return can feel genuine in the moment but lacks follow-through. It's emotionally honest in the context of nostalgia, but not necessarily sustainable in the face of real intimacy. Selective memory isn't just about remembering things differently. It's about emotional regulation. Avoidants often don't have strong tools for managing closeness, so they rely on distance and idealization to feel safe. Nostalgia is one of the safest emotional states for them. It lets them feel connected without being vulnerable. But until they begin to recognize this pattern and confront the full emotional reality of their relationships, not just the highlight reel, they'll continue to bounce between longing and withdrawal. The challenge is to move beyond the fantasy, to ask hard questions. What am I really missing? Am I remembering how things felt or how I wanted them to feel? Can I show up differently this time, or am I still afraid of the same things? Only with self-awareness can nostalgia stop being a trap and start being a bridge to real, lasting connection. One of the most paradoxical aspects of avoidant behavior in relationships is their tendency to return when they sense that the other person has moved on. This might seem manipulative on the surface, as if they only want what they can't have. But the psychology behind it is far deeper and more vulnerable than it appears. What actually gets triggered in avoidance when they realize the person they pushed away is no longer emotionally available is a profound fear of emotional abandonment, something they've spent their entire lives trying to avoid by staying in control and keeping emotional distance. The irony is that the very thing they try to protect themselves from is what they end up feeling once you let go. Avoidants often initiate emotional or physical distance in a relationship, not because they don't care, but because caring deeply terrifies them. The risk of being truly seen, truly known, and truly needed activates their deepest fears about intimacy and loss of autonomy. So they pull away, withdraw into themselves, and convince themselves that they're better off alone. And in the short term, they feel relief. They feel like they've reclaimed their space and identity. But over time, that self-created space becomes a quiet void. They may not recognize it right away, but eventually they begin to feel the absence, not just of the person, but of the connection, the comfort, the familiarity. Now, when someone moves on from an avoidant, something fundamental shifts in the dynamic. That person is no longer emotionally available. They're no longer waiting, no longer reaching out, no longer holding space. For the avoidant, this creates a kind of emotional whiplash. They were used to being in control of the emotional distance. They decided when to engage and when to retreat. But once the other person emotionally detaches, the avoidant no longer has that control. That loss of emotional influence over the situation strikes at the core of their attachment system. Suddenly, the relationship they thought they had on pause is no longer there to return to. That realization can be jarring and painful. What's really being activated in this moment is the avoidant's fear of rejection and abandonment. Even though they may have pushed the other person away, they still held on to the idea that the door was open. When that door closes, even quietly and respectfully, it feels like a loss they didn't expect. That's when longing kicks in. The person they assumed would always be there now represents emotional security they no longer have access to. It's not just that they miss the person, it's that they miss the emotional safety net that was there all along, whether they admitted it or not. The avoidant might then begin to re-idealize the person they lost. They'll replay moments in their head. They'll think of what could have been. But unlike the nostalgia discussed earlier, this reactivation is laced with urgency and fear. They're not just missing someone. They're confronting the reality that they let something meaningful slip away, and that they may not be able to get it back. That's why avoidants often return with intensity after sensing that someone has emotionally detached. They might reach out unexpectedly, express regret, or try to reignite a connection that they once distanced themselves from. To them, the return is not about manipulation. It's about reclaiming something that they now recognize had emotional value. But here's the complicated part. Many avoidants are not fully aware of this cycle. They don't always understand that their desire to reconnect is rooted in fear rather than clarity. They may believe their feelings are stronger now, that they've had an epiphany, or that they suddenly realized they truly love the person. And in a way, they do feel that, but it's often the fear of loss rather than the readiness for intimacy driving those emotions. If the other person responds with warmth, the avoidant might temporarily feel relief, but without doing the inner work to change their attachment patterns. The same fears that caused them to leave in the first place will likely resurface once closeness returns. That's why this moment when the avoidant comes back after sensing detachment is so critical. It can either be the beginning of genuine emotional growth or the restart of another painful cycle. For the avoidant to truly reconnect in a healthy way, they need to confront their fear of abandonment head-on. They need to acknowledge that their need for control and distance is actually a defense against being hurt. And they need to understand that real connection requires mutual vulnerability, not just a response to fear, but a conscious choice to stay emotionally present, even when it's uncomfortable. It's only when avoidants face the truth about why they return that it's often because they fear losing someone they couldn't fully allow themselves to love, that healing can begin. Until then, their reappearances will feel like emotional déjà vu, hopeful at first, but ultimately hollow unless matched with accountability, openness, and change. One of the most overlooked but deeply human reasons avoidants come back is simple. They miss love. And not just love in a general abstract way, but the specific, grounding, meaningful connection they had with someone who saw them, cared for them, and offered them emotional intimacy. Despite what many believe, avoidant individuals are not immune to the desire for love. They might run from it, suppress it, or minimize it. But at their core, like everyone else, they long for closeness, safety, and the feeling of being emotionally connected to another human being. Avoidants often struggle to experience and express their emotional needs in real time. Their instinct is to minimize vulnerability and protect their independence. So when they are in a relationship, especially one with someone who is emotionally available and consistent, they can feel overstimulated. That sense of emotional pressure makes them retreat, not because they don't care, but because they don't know how to stay in it without feeling like they're losing themselves. Their nervous system isn't wired for sustained emotional intimacy. It feels unfamiliar and risky. So they create space. They disconnect. They convince themselves that they're fine on their own. But over time, something shifts. Once the pressure of the relationship is gone, once they've reestablished a sense of emotional control and autonomy, a quieter, deeper truth begins to surface. They miss being loved. They miss the gentle text messages, the emotional support, the feeling of being understood without having to constantly explain themselves. They miss the warmth of physical affection, the sound of laughter during small moments, and the comfort of knowing someone had their back. These are not minor things. These are the building blocks of emotional intimacy. And though they may not admit it openly, avoidants feel the absence of those things in a way that can be profoundly painful. The realization often comes slowly. At first, it might feel like simple loneliness, a vague sense that something is missing. But avoidants tend to suppress that feeling or distract themselves with work, hobbies, or other interests. They try to reassert their independence. Yet, the more they try to fill that emotional void with surface-level distractions, the more obvious it becomes that what they're missing isn't just activity or companionship, it's real love. Not attention, not validation, love. This missing doesn't come with clarity at first. It often presents as confusion. They start thinking about the person they pushed away. They wonder how they're doing. They check social media, reread old text, revisit memories. They begin to feel a pull. Not always dramatic or urgent, but persistent. It's the emotional residue of a connection that mattered. And when they reflect on the person they left, they begin to feel the impact of their absence. Not because the person is suddenly more desirable, but because they finally have the space to recognize what that person gave them. Love in a way that felt steady, safe, and real. And yet, this return to love is complicated. Avoidants aren't just dealing with missing someone, they're wrestling with their own emotional limitations. The thing they miss is also the thing that scared them. The love they want is the love they felt unprepared to receive. That's what makes the cycle so emotionally exhausting for both parties. The avoidant wants love, but the moment it becomes real again, the same fears they had before can resurface. If they haven't done the work to understand and regulate those fears, the pattern will repeat. Still, the fact that they miss love is meaningful. It's proof that beneath all the armor, avoidants have the same core human needs as anyone else. They want to be chosen. They want to feel safe. They want to know that someone sees their flaws and stays anyway. That longing may be buried under layers of fear and self-protection, but it's there. And when the emotional dust settles after a breakup or a period of withdrawal, that longing can be strong enough to prompt them to reach back out. But for the avoidant to return in a way that creates lasting change, they have to do more than miss love. They have to choose it. That means staying when things get close, communicating even when it's hard, learning to sit with emotional discomfort instead of fleeing from it. Missing love is a beautiful first step, but it's not the same as being ready to receive it and give it back consistently. Love isn't something they can dip in and out of based on emotional comfort. It requires showing up over and over, especially when their old instincts tell them to run. When an avoidant comes back because they miss love, they're standing at a crossroads. They can either repeat the old pattern or start building something deeper. And if they choose the latter, it means they've begun to realize that love isn't the enemy of freedom. It's what makes it meaningful. So here's the truth most people miss. Avoidants don't come back just because they're playing games or because they suddenly changed overnight. They come back because something inside them shifts, quietly, slowly, and often in ways they don't fully understand. It might be the relief that comes with space, the softening of defenses over time, the pull of nostalgia, the sting of seeing you move on, or the simple ache of missing real love. But behind every return is a deep human conflict between fear and desire, between the instinct to self-protect and the longing to connect. If you're on the receiving end of this cycle, you don't need to shrink yourself to stay chosen. You don't need to explain your worth or rehearse your pain. You just need to remember this. Their return doesn't define your value, and their confusion doesn't erase your clarity. You get to decide what happens next. You get to ask the hard questions. Are they coming back with growth or just with familiarity? Are they showing up with presence or just with nostalgia? Because at the end of the day, love isn't just about the return. It's about what someone does once they're back. And if they've finally learned how to stay, not just physically, but emotionally, then maybe there's a path forward. But if not, let their return be the closure you never got. Not because they said all the right things, but because you finally saw the cycle clearly enough to walk away from it. You don't need someone who only remembers your value when you're gone. You deserve someone who can handle your presence when you're